Okay, thank you for those of you who are coming back, and for those of you who just joined us, welcome. My name is Nabil Echchaibi. I'm an assistant professor in the Journalism and Mass Communication program here at CU Boulder. I'm also the associate director for the Center for Media, Religion, and Culture, which, along with the Center for Asian Studies, have been collaborating on a project called Muslims in the Mountain West. This is thanks to a grant from the Social Science Research Council on a project called Muslims in World Contexts. And what we had originally suggested to them back in 2009 was, what if we decided to talk about Muslims in the Mountain West and really try to not necessarily just map that presence, but particularly just try to chronicle the diversity and the complexity of the Muslim experience here in the Mountain West, and talk a little bit also about the history of the presence of Muslims in this area. And this is what this panel really is about. But before we move to our distinguished panelists here, I wanted to present to you the website. So the cumulative effect of this project has been a website on which a lot of people have worked. We have been, some of us have been traveling across 6 states in the Mountain West since really the end of 2009. And we've been finding some very compelling stories. You know, people who opened their homes for us and showed us their photo albums about where they lived back in the 70s when they first got to Colorado or to Wyoming, or in really small towns where there was one Muslim family, for example. And it was sort of fascinating. I remember this story in the New York Times after 9/11, which talked about this family, one family in a small town in Wyoming, and how everybody in their neighborhoods actually tried to protect them. And so their neighbors were very protective of this family. The man was a doctor, his wife was also a doctor, and they had kids who went to school, and they had these circles of networks of friends in the community, and the New York Times was sort of marveling at this. And I think we found not only stories like this, but we found other stories that were equally fascinating, if not more fascinating, about really just the extent of the historical connections between Islam and the Mountain West. One thing that I would say, and that you would find in the website, this is still work in progress, we're still filling the site as we go, but one of the historical, I think, gems that we've been able to find out is the fact that the first Muslim to have ever sailed the Colorado River was a Moroccan slave back in 1536.
Wow.
Right? And so this is even before the founding of the United States. And his name was Mustafa Azamur, who actually lived in a small town very close to where I was born in Morocco. And he was brought here by a Spanish expedition. He was a medicine man, sort of had a brown skin. The Zuni Indians tended generally to like him because they thought of him as a wise person who had a special relationship to plants and to nature. Except that when he moved closer into Zuni land, people thought of him as a competitor to their gods, and ended up being killed. Now, it's very difficult to find. We found these things mostly in some historical books, but they were mostly also footnotes that we couldn't really find more information on. So we went to a variety of places. I mean, we looked in archives, we went to universities, we went to historical societies, and it's very interesting how little information there is about these sort of historical connections. Estevanicos, this is his Spanish name. Today, if you Google his name, you'll find his picture and you'll find a little bit of his story. But the fascination is that when you go and look into the oral culture of the Zuni Indians, well, there are conflicting stories about what happened to him. Some people said, well, you know, he was so important to the people that found him that they thought of him actually in very high terms, and they thought of him as a god. And they cut his legs, and they venerated him for 30 years after they found him. And then there's other stories that say actually he was killed in the most brutal way you can imagine. And so it's very difficult, again, for us to ascertain these kinds of stories. But there are nonetheless interesting stories about who walked these lands and who sailed in its rivers and what are the connections between Muslims and the Mountain West. Another interesting story that you find, you see that picture that says Haji Ali? That's a story of a Syrian camel herder who was brought in by the U.S. military in the 1850s and to open up a camel route between Arizona and California. And what was interesting about the story is that the U.S. military brought him along with 30 camels, thinking that this was going to be a cheap expedition, only to find out later that it was going to be actually more expensive than doing it the usual way through horses. And so they ended up bringing total 100 camels, and he was the only camel herder that was brought in. Actually, he was of Greek origin, and his name was Haji Ali. Hajj because he went to pilgrimage, and he had the title of Hajj, which is what the title that is bestowed on you when you perform pilgrimage in Mecca. And so when he came here, the military liked him a lot. Apparently, he was very jovial, very happy man, and got along with a lot of people. And the military didn't know how to pronounce his last name, Ali or Haji, so they took to calling him Haji. Well, today, that story, he stayed actually, he became a military scout for a number of years, and then he lived in a small town in Arizona called Quartzsite, where there is a mausoleum actually now that has his tomb, and it has the story of him living in that town for 50 years. He was the local imam in a makeshift mosque. He led Friday prayer. And what was interesting also about the story is that we found that there is a festival, a High Jolly festival, every year in March. And where they play music, they eat a lot of food, and they celebrate the spirit of High Jolly. And there are rumors and legends and myths in this part of Arizona that says that there are still camel spirits roaming in the desert. And they think that High Jolly spirit is actually there too. There is a country ballad song called High Jolly, sung by Randy Weston, that was written in 1965, which is, to most country music singers, is like a foundational song. And that song, if you ask people about what it's about, most people won't actually be able to tell you the story of High Jolly. But that's what the story is about. It's about this camel herder who came from Arabia and was taking care of camels in the middle of Arizona. So these kinds of stories, sort of multiply themselves, and we found other things sort of more recent and less so, and we try to capture this in this website. As you see there, the interactive map of the 6 states. If you click on one of them, that should give you the number estimate. I shouldn't say that there is a definitive number of the population of Muslims living in the Mountain West, because the Census Bureau does not ask that question. So for us, we went to mosques, we asked communities, Muslim communities, and we used their estimates. When we asked the survey, the Pew survey, and also the Gallup poll about if they had information broken up by state, they told us that in their surveys of Muslims in America, unfortunately, they don't actually call the Mountain West. And so they do not have information on how many Muslims live in the Mountain West. Our estimation of how many Muslims could actually range anywhere between 100,000 to 150,000 Muslims, with Colorado being the most populous, having the biggest concentration of Muslims, particularly in the Denver metro area. And I think for those of you who've been to Eid prayer, or you see how many Muslims actually show up for Eid prayer, and that gives you a sense, at least, of the size of the community. Plus, a number of Muslims are not necessarily practicing Muslims, or if they are practicing, they don't frequent the mosque, and so on and so forth. It adds a different kind of layer. And we certainly did not look only at Muslims who were practicing Muslims, right? And we have sort of documented a range of Muslims who vary in their degree of piety, as well as in their, occupational interests and age and whatnot, gender, obviously, and whatnot. So you have a little About section that if you click on the About section, it gives you some resources. You can find sort of some prominent people in the area. We're still working on that, and so we keep adding to it as we go, as we find more people. And then you'll find also there a list of researchers who've worked on this project. We have featured photos broken down by states. We have videos. Actually, tomorrow, 7 more videos are going to be loaded to the website. And these are videos that are short profiles, right? Like 5 to 6 minute profiles of Muslims in the area. And you'll see that there is a heavy concentration of Muslims in Colorado. And so the site actually reflects that concentration. It was cheaper for us to travel less, although we certainly are looking for more funding to be able to travel to some sites. What you see here is the trailer for this project. It also serves as a trailer of a documentary that we will be producing. And so we're gearing up to start filming in some of these areas where we found not only the biggest concentration of Muslims, but also some, like Court Site becomes all of a sudden a really interesting place to visit, and then sort of really document that and talk to the locals about what do they know really about the story of Haji Ali, and how do they tell it through the festival and through the song and other things that they do to celebrate the legacy of that particular man. There is you can't see it from here, but if you scroll all the way down, there is a section that allows you to share your story. So if you are a Muslim, or if you are someone who just has Muslim friends or neighbors and you want to share that story, there is a place where you could actually do that, and we hope to be able to compile this. Ultimately, what we want to do is really give people a chance to look at some kind of a cultural history of Islam in this area. Obviously, here I'm using cultural history very cautiously, not to make it appear like this is a full-fledged cultural history. It takes years, if not decades, actually, to be able to compile something like this. But it's a start. We start here, and we hope to be able to continue working on this. And I think this panel is also I think a testimony to the diversity of the Muslim experience. Again, as we said in the earlier panel, this is something that should not surprise us, that this is some of the work that we need to do in order to bring this story out, so that we don't have this kind of shrouded mystery about who Muslims are and where they live and who they are. And these are all people who've been engaged in various capacities in both the Muslim community and the non-Muslim community. And I invited them today to really, and I appreciate their time, to really be able to tell you something about their experience, as the title of this panel, Life as a Muslim in the Mountain West, is about. And I'm going to start just giving a bit of information about who they are. I'm going to start with you, Monir. Monir Ludin has been an active member of the Muslim community of Colorado since 1989. He's married and has 4 daughters. In his professional life, he works for a global firm headquartered in Denver, Colorado. As part of his involvement in the community in the past, he has been involved with Colorado Muslim Society, the largest Islamic center in Colorado, in various capacities, including chair of the Education Committee, member of the Executive Committee, and chair of the Education Committee, member of the Executive Committee, and as a member of the board, Shura, of the center. He has also acted as a member of the board of the Colorado Muslim Council, whose mission is to foster cooperation, collaboration, and communication among the various Muslim organizations in Colorado. Monir Ludin has been and continues to be a member of the Steering Committee of Muslims Intent on Learning and Activism, MILA, which aims at getting Muslims involved in community service, interfaith dialogue, and self-education. Monir Ludin has been a member of the Steering Committee of the Abrahamic Initiative since January 2009, and has been acting as the chair of that committee since June 2010. I don't have much information about Taj, because he, the attachment didn't quite attach to the email about his bio. So I have a bio from a couple of years ago, so I'm going to ask Taj to update that for us. Tajuddin Ashaheed, who actually has spoken on various occasions for this particular project, and I'm very, very indebted to him for that. Taj has been involved in community outreach programs and conducts speaking engagements on behalf of the Denver Metro Muslim community, speaking to schools, media, and religious organizations. He is the current spokesperson for the Colorado Muslim Council and a Muslim chaplain to the Denver jail. I don't know if any of these things are still, okay, they're still, okay, good, good. And Dr. Siddiqui and Zeba Siddiqui are both going to introduce themselves. And I don't think I will do justice to them if I just say just a few words. So I'm going to turn it to Monir, and we'll do Taj, and then Dr. Siddiqui, and then Zeba Siddiqui. Thank you.
Good evening. Or as we Muslims greet our friends and each other, Assalamu alaikum. And the meaning of that phrase is peace be upon you. I moved to Colorado in 1989 with my wife and 4 daughters. Before that, we lived in Saudi Arabia for a few years. My wife and I met in Munich, Germany. I'm going to University of Maryland in Munich, and fell in love, and she ended up coming back here. I ended up in Saudi Arabia for some reasons that are not too long of a story to tell you this tonight. But we got married and lived overseas for a few years, and then I had fallen in love with the mountains of Colorado, reminding me of where I was born and raised for the first 16 years of my life in Afghanistan. And when we had the opportunity to move back to the States, I said Colorado is where I will be moving, and since most of her family members were here, it all worked out just perfectly. Our kids were very young. Our eldest was just starting school, elementary school. So it was a culture shock for us because we had lived overseas for quite a few years, even though my wife is American and she's from this culture, but she had lived overseas for many years, and coming back here was an interesting experience for us. But from the first moment for me to arriving here in America, I felt welcome. One of my reactions to my friends at that time was that this is really, and I've lived in many different parts of the world and traveled, this is really the place where I feel at home. That is how our life began in Colorado. One of the first things that I did was, I still, when you're first generation immigrant, it is very hard to just give up everything that you have known and been familiar with and so on. So you can't suddenly change and become somebody different. Your former culture is very strongly embedded in your mind and in your heart. So one of the first things that I did was I went to the mosque, to the Colorado Muslim Society, the big mosque that's on Parker Road, and if you're familiar with it. And I stood out there, and in fact this was an encouragement from my wife, who said, go and see if you can, get to know some people from your own old culture. And I did. And I go there, and I pretty soon figured out where they needed help, and I got involved with the Colorado Muslim Society. And you heard about my work with them and so on. Our children, of course it makes a huge difference when you have a mother who is American and who comes from this culture. But still, they had lived the first few years of their lives in Middle Eastern country with a different kind of perspective, and also we're Muslims, so we have some very funny, interesting stories, and one of those I'll share with you today. We got a call from my youngest daughter's first grade teacher. She called us and said, are you guys making her pray a certain way? And we said, well, not really. She's too young to be praying. Well, she said, she brings this cloth, and during recess, she puts this cloth on her head, goes to the corner of the room, and does all these movements. We have no idea what she's up to. And when I asked her, she says, I'm praying. And nobody should disturb me when I'm praying. So this kind of made us realize how isolated we were as Muslims, really, in the community that we were living in. My wife volunteered to give some informative kind of talks and lectures at the school to the students about why our kids behave the way we behave sometimes. She gave some talks about the culture, the Muslim culture, and what prayer means and what fasting means and things like that. So our life has been filled with these kind of anecdotes throughout, and they've been wonderful. As our kids grew older, they basically, we integrated very strongly or very actively into the American society. One of my, because of the situation in Afghanistan and my personal feelings about what that had done to me, feeling like someone in those days particularly who had no home to go to, I wanted to make sure that my kids don't feel that sense of homelessness in a sense, you know. And so I basically stopped talking and thinking, in fact, about my old culture. And I decided that I'm going to adopt the culture of this country, plus my religion, as my home and my way of life. This was so that they can feel at ease here at home. And that's how we raised them. One of the challenges that the first generation immigrants have, regardless of where we come from, whether it's from the Eastern countries, from Asia, or Europe, from anywhere, one of the biggest challenges is how to deal with the old country, with the old culture, with the old and how to keep a balance between your new life, where your kids feel at home, and your own love of the old country and all those wonderful memories of the past that will often, because of those wonderful qualities that we humans have, is that things of the past seem so much nicer, right? And so I had to subdue some of that emotional feelings. I mean, sometimes it would catch me listening to an Afghan song and tears flowing down my face. But I subdued that so that they would not feel this split between, am I from here or am I from there? Where do I belong? I told them, you are American, this is our country, and this is our way of life. So that's a little bit about myself, and I'd like to talk a little bit now about one of the areas that I've been involved with, which is interfaith, that has truly made a difference in my life, and I think has opened up many doors for us Muslims and opportunities for understanding and learning about each other. There's a phrase or a phrase of the Quran that says that God says to humanity that we've created you into nations so that you may know each other, so that you can learn from each other, so you can get to know one another and so on. And that is really the essence of my life in America and my involvement with the Abrahamic Initiative, and through that with interfaith dialogue and discussion. In that we absolutely need to do this. I mean, it's wonderful to see you all coming here and listening to how Muslims live in Rocky Mountain West. And we need to do a lot more of this. And the Abrahamic Initiative has done a great job for the past 10 years of bringing peoples of the three Abrahamic faiths together. And I'm honored to be the chair of the steering committee of the board now. One of my memories as far as interfaith is concerned is right after 9/11. I was told there's something going on at the mosque. Show up as soon as you can. And I got there and I saw hundreds of people, Christians and Jews and peoples of other faith traditions, standing around the mosque holding hands. And to symbolically show their support for Muslims. To say that, don't assume that all Muslims are, terrorists or whatever. Because there were some threats against the mosque. So this was a reaction to that. These are the kind of examples of what I have experienced in America as a Muslim. And again, from the experience of how my first graders teacher reacted to my daughter's behavior in school, to the way the school allowed us to talk about our faith and explain to them our culture, to people standing around our mosque to protect our faith. As a Muslim, for me, I feel so proud and happy to be part of this country and a member of this country. So I just wanted to share those feelings to you. Often my friends ask, just as a final note, they say, I travel quite, in the past I used to travel quite a bit, but I still do internationally. And they say, have they given you a lot of trouble with the airports? I have been very lucky that has never been an issue for me. But that does not mean that this does not happen to me. Terrible things don't happen to other people, because I follow the information that is sent out about mosques that are getting burned and things like that. But the beauty of this country is that as a Muslim, for me at least, I feel very much at home here, and I just wanted to share that with all of you. Thank you.
Good evening. So my name is Taj, and as Nabil mentioned, that the bio that he read is still pretty much accurate. I think many of us who are active in the Muslim community tend to wear different hats, and we are all generally members of several different organizations, and often, like myself and Monir, have shared experiences with Mila. We're current steering committee members and founding members of that particular organization. And Monir sits as the chair of the Abrahamic Initiative, and I'm a steering committee member. So we all generally tend to intersect and wear all these different hats. So currently I am the spokesperson of the Colorado Muslim Council, and a member of MILA, a member of the Abrahamic Initiative, and probably some other organizations I don't even remember now. And that's really been, at least where I stand today, and a lot of my activity today, is generally a culmination of probably in terms of a marker in my Islamic life, which began in 1993. I would probably say I would have to look at 9/11 as sort of the springboard in terms of my own experience. I did convert here while I was living here in Colorado, and probably for the first couple of years in terms of my experience as a Muslim, it was more transformative for me. I had lived a very hectic life, and had been actually a gang member here in Denver, and also I moved here from Maryland, so that's where I sort of began my thuggish activities, and really went through personal struggles in terms of spirituality, and fortunately made some decisions in terms of turning my life around. And that culminated into my interest and embrace of Islam. And then I quickly began to become involved in the local mosque. I actually ended up, interestingly enough, living very close to the mosque in my neighborhood in Northeast Denver. And my neighborhood was primarily African American, pretty much in the middle of a lot of the gang activity that you probably saw on the news. And so living in that type of neighborhood, a lot of our activity as a community, especially as a local community, began to deal with youth, at-risk youth, and programs that targeted youth. And a lot of us worked out of schools, and we worked in the neighborhood trying to make some attempts to stem what was really a deluge of violence for a lot of years. And in a way, we really, you know, as I listen to Monir, there are a lot of, I mean, we're a diverse community, but there are a lot of things that we share in terms of our experiences. And one of them I found interesting that I see, again, as a convert and in my observance of brothers and sisters who are first and second generation immigrants, is that there's always this experience of being insular. And even in my experience, as pretty much, you know, hot dogs and apple pie, again, my experience as a Muslim was insular in that I was focused on my immediate neighborhood and a lot of the immediate issues that had to deal with where I lived. And that was pretty much, and also the struggle of adopting this new faith that was as foreign to me as probably American life is foreign to an immigrant. It's a you know, being raised in a pluralistic but also secular society is one thing, but adopting a religion that really pushes you to a daily life where you exemplify your religion almost hour after hour is a struggle within itself. And so personally, I dealt with sort of reconciling that, what I had grown up with, and then adopting this new foreign faith and all of these things that were strange to me. I converted right before Ramadan, which I always tell you know, I always caution people who are interested in Islam right around Ramadan. You don't know what you're going to get into. So that was, you know, I was caught up in a lot of, you know, immediate stuff in my surroundings, in my environment, in my own sort of growth in terms of learning and adopting this faith. And then 9/11 happened. And my community and my mosque, and I think the whole of the metro community was thrust into a spotlight that we just simply were not prepared for. We had not really been used to. And we had people coming to our mosque asking questions, and media, and all of these things that we generally didn't necessarily deal with, especially on the scale that happened immediately after that tragic event. And I actually encountered, you know, from that though, I built a lot of relationships with Muslims that I generally didn't necessarily encounter that much, especially immigrant Muslims who lived on the other side of town. And also within the interfaith realm, there was a real spike in terms of interest among, especially the Abrahamic religions, about each other, and especially in the backdrop of 9/11. And so there was a group of us who, because we started interacting more, we decided to create this organization that addressed what we saw was a lack of activity of Muslims in the greater community outside of the mosque especially. But also, more importantly, as Nabil mentioned earlier, also for Muslims who had nothing, who really decided, for many different reasons, not to have anything to do with the mosque or not to frequent the mosque as much as other Muslims did, who were just as devout in terms of their religion and their perspective about their religion as people who go to the mosque. And we did some studies and found that there was a huge percentage of Muslims who simply just don't go to the mosque for various reasons. And so we created this organization, Muslims Intent on Learning and Activism, in order to sort of address what we saw was some problem areas in terms of our activities, especially in the greater community. And from that, built different relationships with different organizations, and from that sprung out the Abrahamic Initiative in terms of mine, and I know, I'm sure, hopefully I speak for Monir in terms of his activity with that group. And from that, personally, I was, I don't know why, but people thought I could speak well, so ended up generally being drafted to conduct speaking engagements and talk with the media and lecture on Islam. And I hope that I lived up to those expectations, because I did make efforts and still have the intention in terms of being studious about the religion. It was a challenge for me to adopt it, but I dove in and was really drawn in terms of the scholarship that's involved within the religion itself, and I still continue that today. So I find myself a little bit more active than I was in my younger days, and still struggling. I guess that's probably the best word. Still struggling with, again, practicing my faith, raising my children. I have a daughter who's 15, and I have a brood of stepchildren who are Muslim, and dealing with those struggles that, and I just laughed to myself when I heard Monir talk about his daughter praying, because I had a similar experience with all of my daughters, and issues about headscarf and trying to deal with, well, should you wear it? How often? Should you not? Is it really a practice, et cetera, and dealing with those things as a family unit. And those things, continue today. My younger stepdaughters are all grown, and they have started families of their own. And so in a lot of ways, I share some of what someone like Monir experiences in terms of being a first-generation American Muslim. And that is one of the things that I think we all share in terms of all of our experience, is this, at least in my opinion, this question mark in terms of what is an American Muslim. Not just in the Mountain West region, but in the country in and of itself. I have a personal philosophy that because Islam is not as monolithic, it's not monolithic at all, but it's certainly not as monolithic as is generally portrayed, especially in mediums like the media, et cetera. I have a particular philosophy that because of our place in the world as a society and as a country, that the Muslims in this country have a very singular position in terms of really being a vanguard. My view about Islam is that historically, different groups of people, based on ethnicity, based on geography, based on various factors, have at certain times sort of been in the forefront of creating the image of Islam and defining what a Muslim is. And I have felt that American Muslims especially, are faced with that potential position. And because of that, I share sort of the feeling that we have as a community, as a national community, and especially locally, we have a responsibility to tell our story. It's something that really drew me to Nabil when I've had the pleasure of working with Nabil as he's launched and really formulated this project. And for me, it was this issue of we, as Muslims, we need to tell our story so that people like going back stop. It's important, and I think it's important for any segment of society to tell their own story. You can't let someone else tell it because they generally get it wrong. And that has, at least in my experience, been the case all too often in terms of portrayal of Islam, and probably more importantly, portrayal of Muslims, which can be two different things, maybe. Depends on your perspective. But for me, that's that's the thing that sort of drives me, is this responsibility that I have, at least that I've taken, to sort of tell the story of my own experience, the story of my community's experience, and hopefully one of the stories of the national experience. And that will help probably draw this picture that's probably a little bit more definitive about what a Muslim is, and especially in this country, as many of us still ask that question and haven't really come across a good answer.
Let's see if this thing works. Can you hear me with this?
No.
No. No. That's why it's strong. My pleasure to be here this evening. And
Okay, there.
do we do something to it?
Just bring it closer to the.
Okay, now?
Yeah.
My pleasure to be here tonight and to share something of my journey into Islam, which is virtually synonymous with my journey in the Mountain States, because I've been living in the Mountain States since 1957, and I've been Muslim since 1965. So instead of introducing myself formally, I'll just mention that my name is Moin Siddiqui. My Muslim name is Zeba, which my husband's grandmother gave to me when we were first married, a family name. We were married here in Boulder at the old Unitarian Church in 1957. We lived here for another approximately 1 year. And then my husband's friend had come from Pakistan to do his master's and his PhD, and he had an engagement to go back to Pakistan and teach. So we go to Pakistan in August of 58. It's a long story. But we came back with a child, born shortly after we arrived there. We found Pakistan to be very difficult to live in at that time for an American, a Western person, not because of being Western, but because of climate and hygiene factors and so on. So we came back to settle, and we settled here in Boulder. Then in 1964, my husband, Moin, was offered a position at CSU in Fort Collins, which we accepted. He accepted. And it was quite a come down. Boulder was very exciting. Fort Collins was a cow town. I have never regretted it, because it's been a very good place to raise children. So we have had 5 children, 3 girls and 2 boys, all of them, of course, 35 on up to 53 at this point, and I think we have about 15, 16 grandchildren, several great-grandchildren. And of course, we've helped to raise the kids. We're helping to raise the kids. When I accepted, as I said, we were married in 57, but I accepted Islam in 64, 65. My introduction to Islam, basically, we didn't have many Muslim people, not in Boulder, and hardly in Fort Collins, where there was a minuscule community consisting of 1 Muslim professor and many foreign students from Turkey and Pakistan and Arab countries, etc. My first experience, I was coming toward Islam, but I hadn't quite made it. So the turning point for me came when we went to Muslim youth camp in California. I went there not as a Muslim and came back as a Muslim. Because there I met people with a quality that I need. It's called certainty. It's called conviction. And I wanted that. And I knew that it was to be found in Islam. Now, early on, I had no idea about Islam whatsoever. We had Hindu friends, we had Muslim friends. I didn't know Hindu from a Muslim. And I thought, allow us some kind of a faith and deity in Muslims worship Muhammad. That's where I was. But as soon as I had made that commitment, that decision, I started learning. No, it's very fortunate because my husband had a very good Islamic education and his profession is teaching, so I was in the best company. I read voraciously about the people, and then we had 4 sabbaticals, 2 in Turkey, 20 years apart, 1 in Jordan, and 1 in Kuwait. And that was a huge part of my Islamic education, to live in, I don't say Islamic society, I would say Muslim society, and to observe and to learn. Coming back from all these stays abroad, brother, as Monir has said, it's very difficult. It's like choosing which set of problems you want to live with. Because I had seen in Muslim countries, I had seen a commitment that is very hard to find here. Two of them just path, not a way of belief, but a path that is calling for us in. And that is a total way of life. The kids growing up in Fort Collins had their own set of problems. Fort Collins, as anybody who's lived in will tell you, is a very white community. And although our kids are white, they have foreign names, they have a foreign religion, they have a foreign father, etc. So at the time they were growing up, there was not a large community of kids their age. And they suffered to an extent from being isolated in their beliefs and practices, but they all grew up to be strong Muslims. Some of them stronger than others, obviously. They survived the task of growing up in a way that had some advantages over the kids who had 2 parents from the back home country, and some disadvantages. The kids whose parents came from another country had a tie-in with the parent culture, which our kids didn't have. They never lived in Pakistan or India where my husband grew up. And their sojourns in Muslim countries were brief, but still long enough to have a very significant impact on them. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the things that were done during my active years. I was involved in Islamic school for a while. We went to Muslim camps year after year after year. We went to ISNA convention. ISNA is the Islamic Society of North America, which holds its annual convention in different cities each year. And that for me in the early years was just, it was wonderful. When I come back compared to the so-called real world, from a world in which the focus had been on religion. It was like coming back from another country in a sense. We had people in Fort Collins, well, let me back up a little bit. In the 1980s, when the Vietnam War was going on, we sponsored a quite significant number of Vietnamese and Cambodian refugees. Some of them are still there, most of them have gone to other places. We set up, the Muslim community bought a farm where they raised sheep for the community's use. Some of the refugees worked at a shop that we had established to help them financially. And we did this with money that had been donated for the purpose. It lasted for a while. We helped out some families, and then sort of went down, and we sold the shop. Later, in the 90s, we sponsored a Bosnian family with having traumatic having tremendous traumatic experiences, and they're still with us there. Those have been challenging and very rewarding pieces of work for the community. We have people a person, at least one person belonging to the Interfaith Council in Fort Collins. In maybe 4 or 5 years ago, yes, then there was 9/11. In 9/11, we were in California in our daughter's house overlooking the bay. You can see the Bay Bridge from there, or you can see the Golden Gate Bridge from there, and I sat there looking out wondering what would happen if sort of cracked the bridge, which thank God didn't happen. We came back the following weekend, and on the first Friday, that is the day of collective worship after the heart of this event, a group of people from various churches and the Jewish community in Fort Collins surrounded the mosque as a gesture of support and protection, all of them bringing white carnations. And that was, I can't tell you how moving a gesture that was. And that was a signal to begin some outreach work that we hadn't been able to do before. So then there were open houses to invite Fort Collins community in to meet with us. Out of one of those open houses came a group called Women for Peace and Justice. This was a collection of women of all backgrounds and faiths who desperately wanted peace, wanted justice, did not want war, did not want to see their sons go overseas to die for a cause that was dubious. And we continued meeting for several months, and then it sort of petered out. Yet it was a very useful thing that brought community members together. 4 or 5 years ago, one of the people we had met in that Women for Faith and Peace and Justice group initiated something called God's October Surprise. It was a confluence of Yom Kippur and Ramadan and St. Francis of Assisi Day. So we made something out of it. We cooked up a program, a tri-faith program, and we called our group the Tent of Abrahamic Initiative. And that group is still continuing and has done a great deal, I think, for those of us who participate. I'm not sure quite what its future is going to be, because we'll have to determine how often we should be meeting or want to meet after 4 or 5 years of doing this. But I've had people who came to it tell me that I'm not sure what my religion is, but I know my religion is right here in this room. So that's been something lovely. Out of it has come a sense of trust. Not only with participants, but the certain knowledge that it's because you belong to a certain faith that has committed oppression and violence, violated other people, does not mean that all people of that faith are like that. Not all Muslims are terrorists, not all, and so on. We have something called the Islamic Trust of Fort Collins, which has helped a number of needy individuals and passed on over a period of 5 or 6 years, something in the order of $100,000, and has helped rehabilitate the ones we work with. I've personally done some prison work by mail, helping, first of all, to rescue a kid who became Muslim in federal prison. He got a 37-year sentence for a murder that he didn't commit, and he's still in prison. And another kid who turned his life around completely and is now a really good one. Many other activities, many stories. a worker at Albertsons comes up to me one day and asks me, what is the best copy, the best version, best translation of Quran? Can you tell me? Okay. We've been doing some interface work with the medical community. We've done some workshops. I've been on ethics committee, and another Muslim is on the same ethics committee now in my place since some time. I feel that our being there and growing up as part of that community has had a positive impact on the community itself. It's an educated community by and large because of our universities. And people are kind. It's a very, very kind town in my opinion. And people smile. We smile back. We feel a total sense of belonging, and we're very happy to be there. I'll just tell you a story or two that I think are worth talking about. We had just bought a new car. We're on our way to the airport, the DIA. We had a flat tire on I-25. Well, we don't know that much about changing tires, but a car stops. A very well-dressed, white, young white gentleman gets out, and without any conversation, he takes the spare out of the, whatever it's called, and proceeds to put it on for us. So we stand and look on, and then gets up, dusts off his pants, and starts to say goodbye. And I said, because I wanted to make a connection with him, and he was obviously wanting to be honest. I said, you can tell it's your personal faith by looking at me. And he said, I can tell you are too. And those were the only words we exchanged. But they were, to me, they were very meaningful words. And we hope to continue to go on and on, doing this and making a mark as a positive influence, as people of peace, as people of justice, as people of goodness, to counteract the bizarre stereotypes that we get on the media. So I think now I will pass it on to my husband. And thank you.
I gave first turn to my wife because usually the impression is that in Islam, women are subdued, they come after men. I want to set an example to show that it's not true. As you can see, with a recitation of 5 children, 17 grand, 16. 15 grand, 16.
We have twins on the way.
Let me introduce myself. I was born some 85 years ago in South India, actually on this planet Earth. But planet Earth is divided by human beings. God created planet Earth, but human beings have divided it to such an extent. There are countries which are stamp sites. They call it Kuwait, just like the stamps. So, I mean, human beings have divided the Earth. So I was born this planet Earth in South India. This was before partition, before Pakistan. Now, people think that India is a Hindu country, but the number of Muslims in India is more than the number of Muslims in Pakistan. The number of Muslims, all Arab countries together. There are more than 200 million Muslims in India. This is the second largest Muslim population, although they are minority, because the Indian population is more than 1 billion. The first Muslim population, first country is Indonesia, then India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. Half of Muslims live over there. Not in Palestine, by the way. Because you hear Palestine, you hear Middle East, you don't hear about India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan. That's half of the Muslims in the world live over there. Okay, but so I was born 85 years ago. I got education there. I got a master's in mathematics from Hyderabad, from the place where I was born. And India was partitioned in 1947, and I migrated to Pakistan. And there, the jobs were plentiful, all kinds of jobs. The Department of Statistics told me, if you can teach statistics, I'll appoint you tomorrow. You know, the head of the department. So I said, I don't know anything about the statistics. He gave me a book, Advanced Theory of the Statistics. He said, go and read it. And tell me in the morning whether you can teach master's program in statistics. Okay, I brought the book. I read it. So and then of course, I had no other choice except to accept the job. So I was teaching statistics in Punjab University, and Pakistan was just beginning to grow. West Pakistan, East Pakistan was two Pakistan. It was one Pakistan actually. We used to call West Pakistan East Pakistan. In 1949, the 1953, I received a letter from U.S. Embassy saying that you have been selected on Truman's Point 4 program to come to the United States if you accept it. So I consulted with my mother and my brother and said, of course. So I accepted and I came in 1953. The first thing I heard was some Republican young guys, picked me up and said, do you know our president? I said, no. Great general. I said, I know of him, but generals don't make good presidents. I was so upset. So to make this story short, I stayed with the Census Bureau for 1 year, and then I also did my master's in statistics at the same time from American University, because we did not have. And I wrote a thesis in 3 months with a great professor I had, and then some of my friends were going to Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Heard of Chapel Hill? So I said, okay, I'll go there. I go there. And there was a professor sitting in a restaurant eating. And this friend of mine said, you want to meet Professor Hotelli? He's the #1 statistician in the whole world. I said, mashallah. I said, okay. So I go there, he's eating. He asked me some questions. I said, I wrote a thesis. He said, send me the thesis. I sent him my thesis. And the next thing I know, that he sent me a letter saying, I have a assistantship for you, research assistantship. So I went to North Carolina. So not only I got my PhD from there, I got my wife from there. She's from North Carolina. She was a student in sociology. I was a PhD student in statistics. But as fate, this is all written up there, by the way. It's all decided before we are born, whom we are going to marry, what children. This is my belief, anyway. So we met in a cosmopolitan club setting, and the story is very interesting. I won't tell you, I'm embarrassed. Anyway, so I finished my PhD there, and I see at that time, statisticians were in great demand. Bell Labs, AT&T, Westinghouse, IBM, all people. I mean, you are still in the first year of graduate year of statistics, and people are coming and picking you up. You see? So in 1957, I took my degree, and immediately I got an offer from Boulder Laboratories of National Bureau of Standards. So I took that invitation. I went to my professor, Hotelli. I showed him I have an invitation. He said, I won't let you go until you publish papers from your thesis. Because he said, once you take a job and nobody comes back and writes papers from your thesis. He said, I'll give you $25 more. My remuneration was $150, so it means $175. So anyway, I wrote 4 papers, got them published. Then I went to him and he said, here, I have acceptance of my papers in mathematical and statistics journals. Could I now go to Boulder? He said, oh, Boulder. Oh, the sky is blue, the air is perfect, the water is so delicious, there are mountains. Oh, you must go there. So then I talked to a friend of mine, her friend actually, and she said, Moin, be careful. You are going to a frontier place. As soon as you come down to Denver, I come by train. Denver, you might find people shooting each other. So I say, people were so ignorant at that time, not only of where I come from. I can tell you a story of the ignorance of people. I'm walking and some lady stops me and says, where are you from? I said, from India. I said, do you have houses there? I said, no, we live in trees. How do you bring furniture there? I said, we bring them on elephants. Another, from Hyderabad, South India, and there are many snakes. I said, oh yeah, we used to play snake. Would you like one? I have one. Now to talk about Islam, nobody knew what Islam. Ignorance, completely. When she met me, she didn't know anything about Islam, Muslims, all kind of things. Mohammedans, this pattern, it's not Mohammedans. We don't worship Muhammad. No, we don't worship Muhammad. Islam means submission. So I mean, this is ignorance. From ignorance, so I came here for talent, by the way, to Boulder. We were not married, we were just engaged. But then when she came, there were 2 Muslims in the whole city of Boulder. And we were looking for 2 witnesses, You have 2 Muslim witnesses for Islamic marriage to be proper. So we found one mathematics student here in Boulder. He was from Iraq, and a few seats still there. And another Pakistan, his name was Khurshid. So I called him. So my boss, he was a Unitarian. He said, where are you going to get married? There is no mosque here, there is no Muslims here. So he said, okay, you come in Unitarian church. It is not a Christian church, it is Unitarian. It's like you worship one God, we also, worship one God. So our marriage was performed in Unitarian church, but we had, the person who performed it was a Muslim, and we had 2 witnesses, so it's okay. don't question the validity of our marriage. And we lived here on University Avenue, 9th Street, for several years. I worked with the National Bureau of Standards for 5 years. And one day I'm eating, I'm in my office, and the secretary said there's some person named Grable who wants to, he's inviting you for lunch. I said, okay, so we are going there. This is Professor Grable from Fort Collins, Colorado State University. They had just was organizing a statistics department. He said, what are you doing in here? What are you doing in the government? I said, I'm doing research. I have published so many papers. I'm consulting with the, with the engineers and so on. Your job is in a state university. I went to the state university. So I have been there since 1964, and I loved Colorado so much. Every weekend, you would find me in the Rocky Mountain National Park. Every weekend, I and one of my friends, Rocky Mountain National Park. One peak after another, one lake after another. By the way, I never tried to climb long speed. That was beyond my capacity, long speed. So this is how we ended up in Fort Collins. So when I came here, somebody called me. He said, Professor Siddiqui, shouldn't we pray Friday prayers? I said, are there enough people here to make Friday prayers? He said, yeah, let's see. So he said, there is you and there is I, and there is one professor from Egypt. But the Bafi, we have 3 people, so we'll make Friday prayer. I said, according to my fiqh, and there was a different fiqh, by the way, Islam, we have four what do you call it? Schools of thought, schools of actually practice. So one of them says, Friday prayer is not obligatory until you have 40 Muslims living in that town. But my school of thought said 3 is okay. That's enough, by the way. You are where? What is your? Maliki. Maliki, okay. Maliki is very tough. So I said, oh, where shall we pray? We don't have a mosque. So we asked the student center, they gave us a room, but there were 3 students. So we started praying Friday prayer. And by that time, then there are more Saudi students there and Pakistanis there. When you have a student community, you don't know who is coming when. So right now we have about 176 Saudi students, maybe about 20, 30 from other Arab countries, from 5, 6 from Pakistan. They're quite a couple. So we started with 3, and then eventually in 1979, all of a sudden, Boulder, Greeley, and Fort Collins, all 3 of them, they told me, you are the senior person here, you be our president. You be the president, and we want to buy a place for prayer. So in 1979, my signature was in Greeley, and so in Boulder and in Fort Collins. We bought 3 churches and made them into mosques. So this is how I started. This is 1980. So the mosque we bought was on Peterson Street. And there were 15 people at that time praying in that mosque. Now, thanks to God, we are building a new mosque. It is such a beautiful mosque. I think people will come from far and wide to see that mosque. It is architecture by a Turkish person, and designed an architecture on the pattern of Turkish mosque. If you have seen the pictures of Turkish mosque, how beautiful they are. On the other hand, a mosque in Saudi Arabia, for example, very simple, except the big mosque. So we are building mosque. So this is the story. By the way, I tell you, when I came in 1953, I knew of only 3 mosques in this whole country. One which was recently built in the Washington, D.C. area and was opened by President Eisenhower, 1948 or 49. When was he elected? 48. 52. There's one. And I knew another mosque, which was in Cedar Rapids, which is called Mother Mosque, the original one, built in 1914. Another mosque in Sacramento. 3 mosques. Now the recent count is about more than 2,000 mosques. So similarly, the same goes in Denver. Now in Denver there are no mosques, and there's 5 or 6 mosques. Right? 5 or 6 mosques, yeah. And one big and so on and so forth. So we are building a beautiful mosque, and we had, we did a lot of work on it. It's called jihad, by the way. Arabic means striving, struggling. It is misinterpreted by people. It is effort, And one of the messages of Islam is you are never free of jihad. That is, you are struggling all the way. I'll tell you a story of one of the companions of the Prophet. I am 85-year-old. He was 90 years old. And and there was some army was going to fight, so he joined that. And he said a Muslim is never free, he is struggling. He's always struggling until the end of his life. So that's the story of Islam in a short cell in Colorado, especially in Fort Collins. Now we count around 1,200 to 2,000. Nobody ever took a census. 2,000 probably Muslims in Fort Collins. As you say, some 100,000 probably in Colorado. And there are about 7 million. This is President Bush who said there are 7 billion Muslims in this country. Of course, some debate about it. But this is the story here. And I'm involved in many things. Right after 9/11, some minister of church called me and said, we have a hate incident response team sponsored by clergy. Would you like to join? I said, of course. So I joined them. And since then I've been active in this hate incidents, and then I joined the Human Relations Commission. For 2 years I worked on that. And then my son and my other children, they're involved in Muslims Against Hunger, things like that. And my wife is very active in this co-op, which is called the Tent of Abraham. Hagar and Sarah. This is an interfaith group. And since 1911, I have been speaking to various churches and so on. So there is a 9/11 is just like AD, so to say, a new era begins from 9/11. So, where people are from being very ignorant became very hostile for a while, but now there also was an opportunity for Muslims to give the message of Islam, to see what is true. So Islam is never secret anyway. The Quran has been translated in all languages. The Prophet's saying are available in English in all languages. So you don't have to go to Fox News to learn about Islam. You should take the original one. You see, in the 10th of Hijrah, there is an ayah which was revealed to Prophet Muhammad. Today I have completed. This is, by the way, from Allah, from God himself. He says, today I have completed your religion, and I'm happy, and I have accepted Islam as your religion. Whether Islam is submission to the teachings of God, the revelation which came to the Prophet Muhammad is contained in the Quran. And so I have been visited by FBI sometimes. I remember once an FBI from Denver they called, Dr. Siddiqui, either we come to every Muslim in Fort Collins or come to you. What do you prefer? I said, come to me. So they came to me and I gave every one of them, say, if you want to learn about Islam, take this book. Go out and read it. And without any bias, without any prejudice. It is not a new thing. It is not, we are not bringing something new. You take the certain word jihad and twist the meaning of it. You take certain meaning. So, take this book and read it, and that's you will get the true message of Islam. So jihad actually is to struggle in this life. The struggle never ends until you die.
So we have a few minutes for questions. I could listen to these stories all night long, and I couldn't have hoped for a better panel. Yes, please.
Could you talk a little bit about relations between Muslims of different branches of Islam in the Colorado Muslim community, if there are any?
I can't hear you.
Should I repeat?
Yeah, please.
Thank you for first for your wonderful stories. And could you talk a little bit about the relations between Muslims of different branches of Islam here in the Colorado Muslim community? I'm not sure if there are members of different branches. Should I give this back?
As you know, there are two main branches of Islam, the Shiites and the Sunnis. In Colorado, we have both. The Shiites are smaller in terms of number. There's one mosque, maybe I think 2 mosques that Shiites use. And the rest of the mosques in Colorado are generally Sunni, or at least in Denver mainly, are Sunni mosques. But the relationship is very cordial, very good. You know, the effect of politics, particularly what's been happening in Iraq, has not had any kind of really major negative effects on that relationship. In fact, the Dialogue Committee of the Abrahamic Initiative is going to have its next meeting. It's going to be at one of the Shiite mosques to get them as well involved in the thing. Now, the fact that there are several different mosques for Shiites and Sunnis, that does not mean that they don't use each other's mosques. For example, in Colorado Muslim Society, in the past we've had members of the board, members of the executive committee of that mosque, which is a Sunni mosque generally, but that are Shiites. Now, again, wherever you find a number of Muslims, you'll have many different points of view and a number of opinions. In terms of jurisprudence, for example, there are different schools of thoughts in terms of how to pray, how to do some of the day-to-day activities and so on. But in terms of also political beliefs and in terms of how strict and how moderate you are and things like that, there are lots of different types of Muslims around. Because Colorado is, in terms of Muslim community, it's a small community, the resources are very limited. We don't have the kind of opportunities that Christians and Jews have in terms of having mosques for different types of the religions. For example, in Christianity, you've got congregations. You can go to a church and know that this is a moderate, very moderate church. And you can go to another church and know that, okay, they're pretty strict, and so on. With Muslims, because we don't have that kind of, the resources are not unlimited, you would go to a mosque and you will find all kinds of Muslims in terms of their adherence to the religion, but also in terms of how strict and how they interpret many different ways of interpreting the religion and so on. As an example, we recently did a dialogue at the Colorado Muslim Society, and we could see from the interaction with people that you had all kinds of, and it was kind of challenging to manage these people with many different kinds of ways of beliefs and so on. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Other questions?
Thank you all very much. Because, at least my very small understanding of Islam is that it's more holistic, perhaps, than a lot of American religions. It involves a whole lifestyle, a lot of daily attention. Not to mention Sharia law, if that's part of your interpretation. But I'm wondering how, particularly, you all have children. How does Islam as a lifestyle interact with the American idea of separation of church and state and compartmentalization, if you want, of various pieces of our daily life? I know that's not across the board. There are Christians who really incorporate their religion into their daily life also. But it seems to be more pronounced, am I correct, in Islam, and just how do you talk about that with your kids?
Personally, I think it was important for me to first understand why our society is the way it is and where the idea of separation of church and state came from. Because as much as we are a secular society, that has not necessarily stopped us from being spiritual in a sense, in pursuing matters of spirituality. And I think that I have found Islam as a way of life, as a practice, as a religion, in many ways is compatible with a lot of other people's thinking in terms of spirituality. And that the issue then of separation of church and state ends up, at least in the conversation, from our understanding, ends up being a political concept. And Lord knows that Muslims throughout the world have struggled with political concepts along with the practice of the religion. Even within religious countries, you have a clash of politics and belief. And so that, at least in my experience, has not been any different here. And so there's also the reality that that this, at least the consequence of the separation of church and state it has been a freedom to practice your religion. And that is certainly something that, as a Muslim, I enjoy and protect, not only just for myself and other Muslims, but for anybody. So that again comes from understanding where does that come from. So in many ways, I have found that the pursuit of the Islamic life, more often than not, has some parallels with what we have created, at least as a national society. And it's actually been pretty interesting and sometimes surprising. And that's something that I've tried to personally impart to my children, that one, learn the politics. I mean, a lot of people just don't even know the politics of this nation. But learn that, understand why, and then you'll find that those are not necessarily barriers to religious life.
If I just add one more thing to what Brother Taj said. There's a concept in Islam that Muslim scholars have talked about, and that's the concept that Islam is supposed to be like water flowing over gravel in a stream, where the gravel is your culture, the culture of where you're from, the context within which you live, and all of that. And Islam is not supposed to change that. Islam is supposed to bring these universal principles that are universal to all faiths and all ways of life, and even those who don't have necessarily a religion as such. But these are principles that we all agree on globally. That Islam strengthens and it emphasizes those principles, and that that the gravel, as a result of those principles, become better and improve, but does not change its identity and so on. Now, the problem that often we face is that when we mix that water with the gravel and create a muddy kind of mixture, and then we impose that money mixture on others. That is the issue. Whenever that happens, that becomes a problem. Islam is very strongly, very strict, I mean, it's very clear in Islamic teachings that that is not supposed to happen. There is and even in our jurisprudence, the scholars, Muslim scholars are discouraged very strongly to make a ruling about a certain Sharia law, for example, aspect of Sharia, based on the context of one part of the world and imposing that on another part of the world. Everything has to be within the context, within the time, within all that. So if you do it that way, if you use these universal principles and add one other aspect to it, and that's God consciousness, that is what Islam says. It basically says, be conscious of God, aware of God in everything that you do, and do good. That's all that it boils down to. Everything else that you see often, you will find, is that it's the muddy mixture that we see on television and elsewhere. So that's my personal opinion. Again, as I said earlier, you will find in a room, many Muslims have different points of view, but this is just mine.
We have room for one more question. More questions because we need to vacate this room. So.
I guess I would describe my question as the separation of science and religion. And that's always it's difficult with any religion. And there have been many difficulties in the past and so on. And I'd like to understand the situation with Islam. For instance, with the acceptance and teaching of evolution in schools in some countries. If you can comment on that.
See, Islam being complete religion also means it is flexible. And it leaves aspects of human being for which God has provided us intellect, observation. So there is actually no conflict between science and Islam in the sense that Islam guides your spirit and your moral character and the way of life, and it says that you are the deputy of God on earth, manage your affairs with consultation, use your intellect. God says in the Quran that I have given you Sama wa Basar wa Absar, meaning I have given you hearing, sight, and intellect. Use it to manage the affairs. And the guidance is only in spiritual matter and matters which are beyond science. That is God Himself, that there is a life after death, that you will be accountable in front of Him. This you cannot discover through science. Science cannot discover whether there is life after death or not after death. Whether the true behavior, that is to respect your parents, for example. Science has no guidance there. So God has given us certain knowledge about the other world, that is, what is it in Islam called the unseen, while the science is concerned with the seen, which we can experiment, and we are free there, completely free. So there is so in a way, the universe is a book of action of God, and the Quran is the word of God, and there is no conflict between the two. Apparently, sometimes people thought there was some conflict. For example, in the Quran it says, وَالشَّمْسَ تَجْرِي لَمُسْتَقَرِّ لَهَا. The sun is going towards its destination. So in 19th century in science, said the sun is stationary, doesn't go. People used to say, oh, here is a conflict between the science and the Quran. But actually now we know that the whole solar system is going somewhere, the sun. So it is, you find that certain theories of science may be changing, but for the time being, it appears as if there is a conflict between the teaching of religion and the science. But always it has been shown that what the Quran says prevails.
All right. Please join me to thank our panelists. And so you know, for tomorrow we have another full schedule. We have a panel discussion at 5 on storytelling, the importance of storytelling for Muslims in the United States, and it's going to involve both a playwright, there's going to be a filmmaker there's going to be someone from the Muslim Public Affairs Council, and they're going to be talking about sort of really the significance of storytelling for Muslims in the United States. And then there will be a reception, and right after the reception we'll have a screening of the film Muslim, and the filmmaker will be here to field questions for a Q&A right afterwards. And so we hope to see as many of you there. Please spread the word so that we have a bigger audience for that as well. Have a nice evening, and thank you for coming.